History tells us that Midway was the day the Japanese Navy died. But if you look at the raw data, Midway was just a shock to the system. The real extinction event, the moment Japan's Day 1 elite pilots were wiped from the sky, didn't happen over a carrier deck. It happened over a tiny, malaria-ridden island called Guadalcanal. And it happened because of a systemic glitch in Japanese engineering. When the war began, the Mitsubishi A6M0 was the most feared object in the Pacific. It was a masterpiece of low-energy dominance. If you tried to turn with a zero, you were dead before you finished the circle. But the Zero wasn't just a plane, it was a fragile paradox. To achieve its legendary agility and its 1,000-mile range with a low-horsepower engine, Japanese engineers had to perform a radical act of mutilation. They stripped out the armor, they removed the self-sealing fuel tanks, and they built the entire plane using a revolutionary, ultra-thin aluminum alloy skin that carried the structural load of the aircraft. This monocoque design is how we build modern airliners today. It's brilliant. But for a warplane, it meant that any damage to the skin didn't just cause a hole, it caused a structural collapse. Against this was the Grumman F4F Wildcat. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't fast, it didn't climb well. The Japanese pilots called it the chunky little tractor. But the Wildcat was an outlier of a different kind. It was a tank with wings. To understand the horror of Guadalcanal, you have to look at the map. The Japanese Zeros were based out of Rabaul. To reach the combat zone over the canal, they had to fly 4 hours one way. Imagine driving for 4 hours through a thunderstorm to get to a knife fight. By the time the Zero pilots reached the slot, they were exhausted, cramped, and suffering from the early stages of oxygen deprivation. Meanwhile, the American pilots were finishing breakfast. Thanks to a network of Australian and New Zealand coast watchers hidden in the jungles, the Americans knew the Japanese were coming hours in advance. The Wildcat pilots had the luxury of a warm-up. They would climb to 30,000 feet above the Zero's optimal ceiling and simply wait. When the exhausted Japanese pilots arrived, the chunky tractors didn't try to outturn them. They performed the boom and zoom. They would dive from the sun, rip through the Japanese formation at 400 miles per hour, and zoom back up into the safety of the altitude. Because the Zero's control surfaces would lock up at high speeds, they couldn't follow the Wildcat into the dive. They were literally helpless against an enemy that refused to fight on their terms. The Zero carried two 20mm cannons, but it only had enough shells for 7 seconds of fire. 7 seconds. In the carrier battles like Midway, this wasn't a problem. You could land on your ship, rearm, and be back in the air in 20 minutes. But over Guadalcanal, there was no carrier. There was only the 4-hour flight back to Rabaul. Because the Wildcat was Grumman Ironworks personified, it would often take an entire 7-second burst of cannon fire just to bring one down. If the Japanese pilot missed for even 3 seconds, he no longer had the firepower to kill his opponent. He was now flying a very expensive, very flammable kite with an 8-hour round-trip commute ahead of him. Conversely, the Wildcat had 35 seconds of ammunition for its 6.50 caliber Brownings. Because the Zero had no armor and no self-sealing tanks, a single 2-second burst from a Wildcat would turn the masterpiece into a flying bonfire. A Wildcat pilot could take off, shoot down 3 or 4 planes, land, grab a coffee while the ground crew rearmed him, and be back in the sky before the Japanese pilot had even made it halfway back to Rabaul. This wasn't just a battle of machines, it was the systemic erasure of skill. The Japanese training program was the most rigorous in the world, producing pilots who were artists of the air. But artists are rare and expensive to replace. When a Zero caught fire over Guadalcanal, that elite pilot, the man who had been training since 1938, was lost forever. Even if he bailed out, he was hundreds of miles from his base in a shark-infested sea. The Americans, however, were mass-producing pilots. They were good enough, rather than perfect. And because they were fighting over their own base at Henderson Field, a downed Wildcat pilot often ended up back in his barracks by dinner time. By the end of 1942, the mathematics of attrition had reached its logical conclusion. The elite core of the Japanese Navy Air Service had been ground into the jungle floor of the Solomon Islands. They were replaced by green recruits with 100 hours of flight time, sent up in aluminum glass cannons to face American veterans who had mastered the art of the high-energy kill. The Zero didn't fail because it was a bad plane. It failed because it was over-optimized for a war that didn't exist. It was built for a world of carrier duels and honor-bound dogfights. It wasn't built for a 1,500-mile commute to a sledgehammer fight. The Wildcat won because it was a systemic counter. It leveraged the environment, the radar warnings, and its own over-engineered toughness to turn the perfect plane into a liability. In the history of the Pacific, the Zero is the legend, but the Wildcat is the reason why that legend ended in the mud of Guadalcanal. If the story of the 8-hour commute to the afterlife changed how you see the Pacific War, hit the like button. Every like tells the algorithm that real history, the gritty, unpolished kind, deserves to be seen. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next deep dive into the archives. What's your favorite over-engineered failure from history? Let us know in the comments below. We read every single one.